Okay, we are going to be working in lesson 9.1 and 9.2, and we're going to finally start taking a look at the pictures or the graphs of a quadratic. Now, keep in mind that a quadratic function, remember function is just a fancy way of saying equation. So the quadratic function is in this form, ax squared plus bx plus c, which we studied in the last chapter, okay? So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to make it into an equation or a function. So when it says function, that's where you see that f of x. You could also just put a y equals or a 0 equals. Usually for writing an equation though, it'll be one of these top two, but you're going to see that we're going to set a lot of things equal to 0 to solve them. Okay, so when we make a graph of it, it's called a parabola. And a parabola is just a graph of a quadratic function, but the most important part is it's going to be U-shaped, okay? So now when we're talking about this, and we're thinking about a parabola, I need you to understand that it doesn't matter if our parabola goes up, looks like a U, or goes upside down, looks like a U, okay? Now, technically, parabolas can open to the sides, okay? But we're not going to study those till Algebra 2. So your main focus needs to be the ones that go up and the ones that go down, okay? So parabola, again, it's just a U-shaped or a curve. Okay, so then we have a couple of very important parts that we need to know about what a parabola is. Okay, so this says axis of symmetry. Okay, now think about what symmetry means. Hopefully you're thinking that's where we cut something in half. And if you're thinking that, you would be correct. So it's the line that divides a parabola in half. Okay, now there is a formula that we're going to use to find it, but we're not going to use this formula today, but let's go ahead and get it written down. So it's going to be x equals negative b over 2a. And one of the things I want you to think about here is if we look at the actual quadratic formula, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, your axis of symmetry, or where it's cut in half, is right there. Okay, so all of the stuff we've been working on, quadratic form and all that, it's all related, it's all pieced together. Okay, so again, axis symmetry, just where are we going to cut the parabola in half? Okay, the next vocab word we're going to need to know is called vertex. And vertex is basically the highest point or the max or the lowest point, which is called the min. Okay, so now if I kind of come back up here and look at these pictures real quick. So what I'm talking about first off is axis of symmetry. Where would it get cut in half? And so in this case, let's just say that these are the halfway point, okay? So I draw a dotted line for axis of symmetry to show here's where it's cut in half. And then my lowest point or my highest point would be called the vertex, okay? So this guy right here is a low point, so it's a min, because everything shoots up from there. This is the high point, it's a max, everything shoots down from there. Okay, so now coming back to vertex, again, the highest or lowest point. And again, we're not going to find the vertex today, but let's go ahead and write this down for tomorrow or for the next day. Plug your AOS, and I didn't point that out. Let me come up here real quick. So when I say AOS, I'm talking about axis of symmetry, okay? So instead of writing out axis of symmetry every time, I'm just going to start abbreviating it as AOS. So down here, it says to find the vertex, plug the AOS into the equation, okay? So axis of symmetry. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, on the next one. Now this is kind of a big guy, okay? All of the things that we have been studying, quadratic formula, solved by factoring, solved by taking the square root of both sides, has been leading us to this guy right here. This is the big guy, okay? So we are looking for where does something cross the x-axis or the x-intercept, okay? So we can say it's called a root, it's called a 0, it's called a solution, or it's called the x-intercept. Okay, so I can interchange those words and mean the same thing. So instead of saying what are the solutions, I could say what are the roots, or what are the zeros, or what are the x-intercepts. All four of those words are kind of interchangeable. They mean the same thing. Okay, all right, so now let's take a look down here at our first example. So it's asking us to look at this picture here, and we're just going to identify the following parts. Okay, so first thing we're going to look at is axis of symmetry. Axis of symmetry is where we cut this in half, okay? So if I look here, my axis of symmetry would be right there. And we show axis symmetry with a dotted line. Okay, so now the question is where am I cutting it in half at? Well, I'm cutting it in half at -2. Now, this is technically a line, so we're going to put x equals -2. That's where it gets cut in half. Okay, now my vertex. Again, vertex is the highest or lowest point. So if I'm looking at my picture here, I have the lowest point right there. And so we just need to write what coordinate point is that. So the coordinate point would be -2, +1. Okay, -2, +1. Now I'll give you a hint here, guys. If you have -2 here, you better have -2 there in your x position. Okay, those should be directly related to each other. Okay, all right, next thing. We're asking, is that point up here, is this a maximum point? So is it the highest point? Or is it a minimum point, the lowest point? And so hopefully you're thinking, well, that would be the low point. So that's your min. Okay. All right, and then let's drop down here. We'll talk about domain range here in just a second. Let's drop down now and let's look at the solutions. Okay, so solutions is where does it cross the x-axis? So if I'm looking right here at this guy, it never touches that x-axis. If it never touches it, it doesn't have any answers. So in this case, there are no solutions because it never touches it. Okay, all right, so now domain. Okay, let's think about domain is your x values. Okay, so if you need to kind of write that in there, let's go ahead and write that in there. So this would be your x values. This is review. And your range is your y values. So what we're trying to look at up here on our graph is on our domain, what values of x, so thinking here, get graphed. And what a lot of students will say is well, at -1, there's a point. At -2, there's a point, and at -3, there's a point. And they're correct, but they're not completely correct. Because don't I have a point at all these little fractions right here and all these decimals? And not only that, don't I have stuff coming out this way? And then we got to think, what do those arrows mean? Well, those arrows tell us that it's going to keep going on forever and ever and ever. And as we open up, it keeps getting wider and wider and wider. So when we're asking what values of x are going to be graphed, eventually all of them get graphed. Doesn't matter if it's out here at 100. Eventually I'll get a point way up there. It doesn't matter if it's just at -5 right here. Eventually there'll be a point there. So when we're asking for what domain values are being graphed, your answer will always be all reals. All numbers will eventually get graphed. Now your range is a little different because range there is a cutoff. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. So on my range, okay, we are now looking at my y values. Now, on my y values, in this case, here's my lowest one, and then I'm just going to shoot up from there. Okay, so that means down here, nothing is going to get graphed. So we have to kind of talk about that. So since we're talking about our range or our y values, we're going to start this off with a y. So I'm going to have y. Now, since my picture's shooting up, I'm going to put greater than or equal. So if it goes up, it's greater, and if it goes down, it's less. And then we need to figure out what is the lowest y value here. So if I'm thinking about what is my lowest y value, well, what is that number right there? That number is a 1. Okay, so when I come back down here, I'm going to put y is greater than or equal to 1. Now, little hint here. This guy, this guy should be the same as this guy. Okay, so if you have your vertex, you already have the answer ready to go. Okay, all right, so let's try this again. So axis of symmetry, where is it getting cut in half at? Okay, well, if I'm looking at my picture here, it's getting cut at 2. So x equals 2. Okay, now gang, x equals is not optional. You have to have that. Okay, now I'm looking for my vertex. Well, my vertex, the highest or lowest point. Okay, so my coordinate point here would be 2, 4. Okay, and since it's my highest point, we know it's a max. We know domain, or my x values. Eventually all of them get graphed, so all reals. Now range starts with y. And in this case, since we're going down, Okay, it's going to be less than, so make it look like that L, less than or equal to. Now, what is my y value here? Well, my y value here is 4, or remember, we can just pull it from right there. Okay, so 4. Again, this guy and this guy should match, this guy and this guy should match. Okay, now my solutions. This guy, we actually have solutions because it actually crosses. All right, so my solutions are going to be here at 0 and here at 4. All right, and that's all you need to write down there. You don't need to write anything too fancy here. You can just say that x would equal 0 and x would equal 4. Now, some people always ask, I always get the questions, could we just write it as like x equals 0, comma 4? Yes, just don't put parentheses around it because then you're trying to say it's a coordinate point. Okay, so in reality, we talked about that these are really just intercepts. So your intercepts would be 0, 0 or 4, 0. Okay. And then I even have some people who will just put 0 and 4. I really don't care. Just make sure that I can tell what your answers are going to be. All right, let's go ahead and turn over to the next page. All right, so example 2, this is the last example we're going to look at for this video. On example 2, it says write an equation of a quadratic function. Okay, so equation, remember, equation of function, kind of the same thing there. Okay, there's only one piece of information we need off of this picture. And that is, where does it cross the x-axis? Okay, so I'm going to get answers. X equals 2 and x equals 4. Okay, because again, that's where it's crossing my x-axis. That's the first piece of information I need. So now what we got to do is we got to think backwards. So we are given the answers, and we have to figure out what were the factors that got me to x equals 2. So if we think about this, we're actually going to bring that 2 back over and get x minus 2. And then we're going to bring that 4 back over and get x minus 4. Okay, now we're writing an equation, so we need y equals, or if you wanted to put f of x equals, that would be fine. Okay, so now when all I'm doing here is figuring out what were my factors that got me to here. And just kind of keep in mind that once we knew our factors, in the earlier lessons here, once we knew the factors, right, we just took x minus 2 equals 0, and so we ended up with x equals 2. So again, we're just working backwards. You're given the answer, come up with what the factor should be. And guys, basically, you're just changing your sign. I mean, that's what's kind of happening there. Now, you'll need to go ahead and FOIL this out. Okay, so I'm going to get x squared minus 4x minus 2x plus 8, or I'm going to combine the middle there and get x squared minus 6x plus 8. And again, we need a y equals. And that right there is your answer. Now, sometimes on like PSAT or SAT or something, you might see something like this instead where they didn't factor it out. Just note that this guy and this guy are the same thing, okay? All right, so now let's take a look at what happens when we have a parabola, but it's going down now. Okay, so there's one adjustment we'll make for that. But to start it off with, we're going to do the exact same thing we just did. We're going to figure out where does it cross the x-axis. And so I have x equals -2 and x equals 0. So again, what were my factors that got me these answers? Well, it would be x plus 2. Again, we're just moving that 2 over. Now, with the x and 0, you can move the 0 over, but it's not going to change it. Really, it's just an x. Okay, we have it equal to y, or again, you could put f of x. Now, here's the change, though. When it opens, when it opens down, okay, down, we're going to put a negative out front here. Okay, so we are going to put a -1 out front, and that's going to show that it's opening down. That's the difference between up and down. So if we're going up over here on this guy, since we're going up, technically we do put a 1 out front, but we know putting a 1 out front is not going to change the value at all. That's why we really don't show that. All right, so over here now, we're going to go ahead. We got to FOIL or multiply. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and push the x through and get y equals -1, x squared plus 2x. And then I'm going to go ahead and distribute the -1 through and get y equals -1 x squared minus 2x. And that right there is going to be my answer. All right, so now just kind of a side note here. Right here, if your a value, change that over. If your A value is negative, it opens down. Okay, that's very important that you understand that. A value is negative, it opens down. So over here on this guy, because I have a positive 1 out front right there, if my A value here, right, so A value is positive, it opens up. So we're going to open it up, okay? All right, that concludes the first part of notes for lesson 9.1 and 9.2.